Hi, David.
Hello, David.
Very well.
Hi, David. It's me, Salah Hassan,
Hi.
and
Hello.
Lesley
Hello,
Lokko.
Salah.
Hi,
We are,
David.
Hello.
we are on the stage. We can see you, but you
Okay.
can't see us.
I can't see you, but it's fine.
You can imagine. It's not a...
I can. Yes, I have been on that stage, so I can imagine.
Okay, but let me begin this session
Okay.
by welcoming you, David, from Accra, Ghana, and Lesley here in I was about to say Ithaca, New York, Sharjah, UAE. So let me just say thank you so much to the organizers for trusting me with moderating this conversation between two highly accomplished Ghanaian architects and leading figures in their respective fields. Our conversation is hoped to be around the idea of return, as it is mentioned in the program. And of course, other points related to that will emerge eventually about the practice of David and Lesley. But one thing that I would like to start with, I mean, the biographies of each of the two architects is available in the booklet, so I wouldn't, kind of repeat that. But let me delve directly. First of all, let me welcome both of you, David and Lesley, but also start by saying congratulations to Lesley for being appointed the next artistic director of the Venice Biennale of Architecture. It is, of course, a very well-deserved appointment, no doubt about it, but it's also historic. This is the first black woman to be appointed to that position. And that is now a record, like Okwe and Wezor to be the first black. It's, of course, an accomplishment, but it also speaks to the sad affairs in the Eurocentric world. But anyway, you did it. So congratulations.
Thank you.
So, welcome, David, but also I want to congratulate you too for our building, which is actually an award-winning, and it will be one of your high, points in your careers. That's what we're hoping on. In 2024, we will celebrate it. So thank you, David. So let me just start by the subject itself. The two of you are itinerant figures, cosmopolitans, born to parents who are mobile. David, you are a son of a diplomat. You were born, from what I understood, in Dar es Salaam, and then moved your life, the same thing, across the world, in the global north and the global south. And you too, Lesley, you have taken positions in many places, Johannesburg, London, and even the US recently as a dean in the Coopers Union. So what does the return for people who are mobile like you means? The return to the continent, the return to Accra. I think the idea of return has multiple. It also, of course, sometimes related to exile or self-exile, but it's also related to mobility and choices and the ability to move around. So I'll start with you, Lesley.
For me, it was very much about coming home. It was a real homecoming in the sense that I'd spent most of my working life, my adult life, outside Ghana. And I think this will resonate with many diasporans, that I am never more Ghanaian than when I am outside. And I wanted, in this sort of last 10 years, if you like, of my career, to test what the 30 years outside meant back home. This, for me, would be the kind of final test. And I think, I said it a little bit earlier, I've built my career around looking at the relationship between race and architecture, but race is figured very, very differently in Ghana. So for me, this would be a really interesting moment to try and push my own thinking and my own practice in a space that's meaningful to me emotionally, but also politically and socially, yeah. So.
David?
Yeah, no, it's so interesting, this question. For me, I guess in my mind, being born on the continent and having parents who were very much part of the experiment of independence and a kind of new world order where Africans were equal citizens. I was brought up to not, I was brought up to feel that the world was mine to engage with, but that I was African and that was my home. And so in the same way as Lesley speaks about home and being Ghanaian, really more Ghanaian outside than actually inside in terms of the diaspora experience. I felt as though I'd reached a certain stage of my career, and I'd reached a certain stage of my ability to understand the world, and that I no longer needed to be. I no longer needed it as my center. So in a way, it was for me a recentering and a return after a sort of long, sort of, as it were, excursion into the world. So for me, it's really about recentering and to really put into practice, I think, inevitably, I guess, what my parents sort of had hoped, which was that one would be a Ghanaian that was able to be in the world, but also be at home. So, yeah.
So how has it been so far, if I may ask you, Lesley? And I want to ask a specific question because you have been a novelist for a while. And from what I understand, you wrote a lot of romance novels. I don't know if that is within Ghana or outside Ghana. So how has it been so far since your return?
I mean, it's been mixed. I think I can't remember who says it, that novel, that the past is always a foreign country. They do things differently there. So what you remember is invariably tainted by the fact that you haven't been there. So for me to go back as an adult and to work professionally was a challenge. It's been, I guess I would say that the relationships I have with the young, and by that I mean 2 generations behind me with the kind of 20 to 25 to 35-year-olds, has been amazing. The kind of hunger, the ambition, the drive has been phenomenal. And there's a kind of dynamic character to that relationship between the Institute and its audience. At the kind of institutional level, maybe also at the social level, it's been more challenging than I thought. But I think that's the nature of all new things. You have to earn your place in a way. So I think I'm very much still in that trial period of earning the right to be there, yeah.
David?
No, I think it's, returning is always a tough thing. It's romantic in the mind, but the reality is, Lesley has outlined, is always different. It's coming on to my 3rd year of being here. And for me, it's also been about a resettling with family, so it's been different to, I guess, Lesley's experience. And for me, in terms of my relationship with my family, my immediate family, and my sort of relatives that I haven't known for a very long time, it's been actually very special, and a rebonding. So for me, it's been more intimate and less about. I'm also of the age and of the time that it's not about making new friends, really. So I have a kind of collection of friends in the world. And it's really about, for me, this bonding with my family here. And also, for me, it's also been about creating a new business here, very much. So that has been all-encompassing, but also very, very invigorating. And to set up an office in Ghana, to set up an architectural office that is, over 80 strong now, with a sort of whole generation, young Ghanaian architects, and also African architects, working on projects on the continent, has been just all-consuming, but also so invigorating and so exciting.
I wanted to shift to a novel, actually, but I wanted to ask about this through a Sudanese novel that is known as the Season of Migration to the North by Tayyib Saleh. In the main protagonist is Mustafa Said, who is this itinerant, as Edward Said said, is really one of the most important novels of the 20th century in terms of the life of the itinerant post-colonial intellectual. He goes to London, he goes through all these escapades of metaphoric sexual encounters, but then who was also an intellectual, part of the Hyde Park Sea, became a very prominent, intellectual, a Fabian, a socialist economist, and a dreamer, but he was also engaged in this encounter with the West, in which he sometimes embodied in a perverse way the Orientalist, tropes about the black man or the Oriental man. In any case, the most important is his return. He chose not to go to a city. He chose to go to become a farmer, and then he built a house, but in which he kept a room that nobody entered, and it's only his alter ego, the narrator, towards the end of the novel that managed to enter and discovered it was actually an intact, Victorian room that he never allowed anybody to enter, even his own widow, who was always silenced who was a village woman, a simple woman, and not, it's unlike the women that he encountered there. But it was a Victorian room with a chimney and every aspect of the, as if it was in London. So, but it's of course a metaphor of him, despite his return, he always kept this Victorian room. It also reminds me of how Yinka Shonibari, he has a Victorian room, which he shaped it and he polished it with an African fabric. Do you have a Victorian room? Or what is your Victorian room? If I may say metaphorically.
David, do you want to go first? I've got to think about this.
I mean, Salah, that's such a great quote. I don't have a Victorian room, no. But I think that in that novel, the thesis is a kind of return back to another world, and then there's a longing. I think that in the 21st century, that narrative is changed again, because the thesis is no longer a sort of return back to a certain kind of romantic condition and then sort of to live, happily ever after. The thesis is to really, I think, to be in the world and but to operate from Africa. And I think that that's the really important moment that we're in, is that we are now in a world where, any critical thinker or any critical person in business or in any other form is engaging with the world. And what we've had is a situation where the only way in which one could engage in the world was to engage from the West or from the global North. And I think that illusion has to be shattered, and that illusion for me has been shattered because it is no longer even it holds no water at all. In fact, my criticality is sharpened by coming home to my home personally, and to be able to kind of operate from home in the world has actually increased my own sort of criticality in terms of how I see and want to kind of operate within the world, but also the ability to have that comfort of not feeling as though one's outside of something that is, more urgent than where you are, is also been shattered, because actually the issues are all around, and the issues are really planetary, no longer about a certain race or a certain pedagogy that we are desperately trying to kind of harken on to. There are many models, many moderns being kind of erupted, and I think there are many stories that are so critical. And so I think that the decentering of this idea that the North is where the center is really important. And so for me, that when that illusion sort of shattered, I really felt that I no longer needed to be part of that, to be in that, to be part of that. I can be part of that conversation without being in it. And for me, the criticality is about being where one feels the idea of home comfortably, without it being sort of imposed through a sort of, the lens feeling in or out of a center. But the center is within where you create your base, and then the dialogue is with the world. And for me, that is the model that I'm most interested in, and the model that is exciting to me. So the Victorian home is no longer needed because I can go to the Victorian home, but I also want to return back to my home. And that's really important.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, as David was speaking, I was thinking about, I grew up in Accra, in Burma camp. My father was a military doctor. And I used to apply to magazines in the UK and Germany for kitchen catalogues. And so I'd fill out the back of a magazine, and then 3 months later, a kitchen catalogue would appear in our post office box, and I'd take it home and I'd kind of look at these kitchens. And there was something about the idea of the home, the construction of a home, as a way to navigate the itinerant childhood, a few years in Ghana, 2 years in Scotland, back and forth. And I think those kitchen catalogues, when I think back on it now, were probably the first premonition that architecture would be for me more than a profession. It would be a way to construct, I guess, a kind of identity. And now, after all of this time, I guess my Victorian room equivalent has always been hybrid. It will find bits of one in the other. So in a way, I'm no longer one or the other, which is, that's kind of who I am geographically, racially, etc. But it was very interesting for me that writing couldn't quite knit together these disparate influences, ideas. Architecture was the discipline that could do it, yeah.
It's actually, I didn't mean to compare you to the protagonist, but I recently actually have a trip. I lived a life like yours, traveled to the US, taught in an American university for almost now 30 years, combining that with the graduate school. And I recently took a family trip, basically really to show my son all the ancient Nubian civilizations across the Nile. And I remember when I reached Jabal al-Barkal, it's actually an area where Tayyib Saleh, the author himself, and where the setting of the novel itself takes place, especially when it's in Sudan. And so I really looked at Jabal al-Barkal, which is supposed to be the most spiritual, place in the ancient times, and dreamed of a land that I can build in a home. Mm-hmm. And I actually found a piece of land, and with all the dreams of going back, because I still have that dream of return, and I found a piece. And I hope one of you, or the two of you, could design.
It'll be him.
With a Victorian room. It's okay. Anyway. But anyway, I think that dream we share of the return, and all of us have their own dream about retiring in a quiet place, or maybe have a half a life in the US during the summertime, and in the winter when it's too cold that you resort to this area. And I think I will invite you both to Jabal al-Barkal one day. It's so beautiful in the winter. So anyway, I wanted to move to another subject that both of you are engaged, and you specifically, Lesley, in the establishment of the African Futures Institute. And I think both of you are engaged in this project, and what a wonderful project when I read about it. So tell me about it, and why futures and not future?
I started a school of architecture in Johannesburg in 2015, and it was an incredible experiment. And now when I look back on those 5 years, I recognize that it was a kind of pilot, like I was testing out something. And the South African condition is also very specific. So in a way, it was a kind of landing pad for me to come from the global north, to embed some of the ideas that I developed there on the continent, but in a slightly different way. And after I'm not going to talk about it, but after a disastrous, few months in the States, I decided, well, it's now or never. And, David and I had been talking about this, I think probably over the last 10 years, about the need for not just another school, but also a different kind of school. And in the opening kind of lines of the e-brochure that describes the African Futures Institute, there's a number of what-ifs. And for me, this what if question was really provocative. And exactly as David was saying in slightly earlier, the idea that the center has shifted, that the answers are no longer in the old centers, that new answers and new questions can emerge from different locations was really important. But also the experience of having worked in the academy outside, I kind of knew almost what I didn't want to do. And it's not to say that having done this, in 5 or 10 years' time, I will think that this was the right kind of institute. But somehow the experiences of knowing what I didn't want to do has really informed this. And having this group of patrons and trustees, this kind of sounding board around me, has been both a privilege, but also an absolute pleasure, because somehow now we can dream afresh. And I think the events of the last couple of years have really shown us that there are new ways. There are new ways to teach, there are new subjects to teach, there are new combinations. So for me, the question of the location is really important, because I think it's time, certainly in our discipline, that we speak both back and to one another.
David, any more reflections on this subject?
No, I think Lesley just really reinforced it. The conversation with, Lesley's a powerhouse, an incredible inspiration and an educator, and actually a really gifted architect if she wanted to do it. She just didn't ever seem. I think there were too many compromises in architecture for you, Lesley.
I can't put a light bulb together.
But I think that this idea of the futures was just so clear that it was required and that the time had changed. And I think that in every age there's a time when things shift, and I think that institutions that are made aren't necessarily always equipped to be able to handle those shifts immediately. They need to reform usually, and that usually takes a huge amount of energy and time. And that is a window when new things are born, and the new things are of the time and are ready to deal with the complexities of the time. And I think that's what the AFI is really about.
Yeah. And, it's really interesting you use that word reform, because I've been asked, many times when I've gone into an institution, the conversation is about repairing an existing institution, that somehow you bring an agenda of change or transformation and it makes the existing place better. And I have really ambivalent feelings about my role as a repairer. It is not my job to fix something that I was not always culpable. And so the idea then that you could create something, and again, this goes back to the idea of architecture being also more than buildings. The building of an institute, its organizational hierarchy, its finances, that's also a form of structure making. So to me, it was a way to deploy skills as an architect that are not in a physical building, but they're in the building of an idea, let's say. And David and I have spoken about this over the years. The idea that architects are also, particularly in Africa, we're in the business of building knowledge, not just building buildings. So yeah. I think it's very similar.
I would argue that the building of knowledge, Lesley just not to cut it in any way, but I think that the building of knowledge is the critical issue on the continent, because it's simply been devastated and disaggregated. And really building that body of knowledge, which then becomes a kind of a resource for a new generation to feel confident about how the knowledge of the continent can actually inform a new vision of how a built environment works across the 6 geographies of our amazing continent of Africa is just too important to not happen. And it's not, we haven't seen it, we've been watching. I think we've always thought that we were too young and that somebody else was going to do it. And then you realize that as you get older that actually, no, you have to get on with it because it's not appearing. And if that feeling is there, you have to sort of go with it. That's what life is about. But anyway, for me, my job is to really be one of those patrons that Lesley spoke about, to be to find ways in which we can bring this thing into being. this baby that really is Lesley's brainchild.
So Lesley, I'm curious about, like you've taught architecture in different places, Johannesburg, London, but also the United States at the Cooper Union. I wonder if you can reflect on that experience, because it could be helpful just to understand in terms of approaches, in terms of the facility, in terms of the ease, with which you could change, minds or design curriculum. How was it for you moving between these places in the academic world?
I studied in the UK. I studied at the Bartlett, and at the time, I joined what they called the old Bartlett. So there was a kind of traditional curriculum in place, and then in my second year, Peter Cook arrived from the Architectural Association via Germany and brought a new curriculum. And none of us knew, and we didn't even know who he was. But the curriculum that was put in place was very open-ended, very, very generous in its approach. So it was quite easy for someone like me who had an interest, even though it was very badly formed at the time, in things like race and gender and power, things that were kind of marginal to architecture. It was very easy for me to bring those interests to it because the curriculum was quite confident. It was open. I never found that space again. In some ways, it was an aberration. And so when I left the UK to teach in the US, and I've spoken about this before, I think it was the first time I ever heard the phrase, the design problem. And I kept looking at the students and saying, they would ask me, what's the design problem for the semester? And I would say, what do you mean? Which problem? Like, I'd never understood architecture as problem solution. And there was something about the American professionalization of education that I thought if you were trying to bring new knowledge, new perspectives into play, you would run up against the structure of knowledge. The semester system, the credit hours, the electives. I mean, it's a very, very fragmented structure. And actually, architecture is largely about synthesis. It's about bringing disparate things together. So for me, the nature of the American system just didn't work if you were trying to tackle something else. When I got to South Africa, I found a curriculum that I think was so out of date that it kept looking back to Europe for validation of what it was doing. But the Europe it was looking at left the station 50 years before. Like, they were looking at a Europe that didn't exist anymore. And suddenly, in this context, you had a kind of revolutionary hunger and an even more outdated curriculum. So I think at that point I thought, okay, there's something about this relationship between curriculum and structure and knowledge that can only be tackled at the kind of institutional level. And in the end, I think that's why, as David said, there were just too many compromises to be made to change something that inherently doesn't want to change. So let's start again.
I encounter similar problems in terms of trying to change, not only in the African-American studies, which has its own issues in terms of syllabi, fields, what to study and not, what new imperatives to include, but also in art history, because that is the most Eurocentric field, and how do you change it? And the challenge has always been is that you have limited number of faculty lines. And then if you ask for more, you can't cover the whole world. So one device that I use is to really move into a global type of art history and to redefine new lines, like even if you have a Renaissance, let it also include the darker side of the Renaissance. Let it include Latin America. If it is Baroque, do it globally. If it is medieval, focus on the Mediterranean, because that's where the circulation of ideas that bring Africa, the Arabia, and Asia. So there are ways of moving within those. And I thought it was frustrating sometimes, but it was exciting, because at the end, you have actually new type of students and graduates who actually shifted to this global. Because, and what I find interesting in being in the West is and I don't know if that's your experience, is actually the students, as you actually mentioned, have the hunger to study, this desire to study the world globally. They go to biennials, they go to shows, and especially with interventions, people like Okwi and others, it shifted the world. It shifted the art history completely. So you have an old regime of Eurocentric scholars, versus a young students, even European or Americans, who are really trying to be global and move towards a global syllabus. David, unless you have a comment on this, but David, you are, as a theorist and architect too, you have your own ventures into knowledge production, authored several books, and one of them is the one on African cities, which, so if you can reflect on combining practice with theory, combining that with knowledge production.
I think that there are moments when a confluence happens where I think that I feel as though I cannot practice without producing also the sort of trail of what my sort of research has been based on and how that work has manifested. I think that for a lot of people, there's been a huge misunderstanding of my work because it's simply because the knowledge base in which they want to understand the work has always come from a Eurocentric point of view. And assuming that because I was educated in the West, that my references would only be Western, there's been a confusion about how the kind of the sort of result of the work has manifested because it doesn't look like my peers. And so in a way, I think there is always a confluence when that happens, where an unfolding of what the knowledge base is critical. And so I find myself at this junction where I'm a sort of hybrid architect because I can't exist any other way. I have to make the work because I had to produce the work to exist, to become a professional. But then I also have a responsibility to show how the body of knowledge that I'm using kind of uses frameworks that are not in the main canon and has a position which tackles and unravels certain, really actually just colonial structures deliberately to try and show how architecture is a very, very relevant force in the arsenal of, the arts that we all have to really reimagine the world again. That's what we use the arts for. That's what the best artists I know do, help us reimagine the world again. And so if the basis of the work is now really moving from a place that's been discredited as having no kind of knowledge worth using, and one finds oneself actually abundantly bathed in an extraordinary amount of knowledge, which is so pertinent to how to make the world, and actually even more pertinent about how to make the world now because of its histories and its trajectories and its modernities, which are so important in really creating the kind of multiple identity figures that we are as Africans, able to kind of move in so many other worlds and being able to also be in the center of our own place. I think that knowledge has to be, I think that knowledge is sniffed by a younger generation who are very interested in the work that, I find that my work is most received by the younger generation who are very hungry for how is this working? How did you manage to do this? What are the things you're looking at? That I'm at the same time producing, the trail, as it were, of knowledge, but also trying to through kind of collaborations with Lesley and other thinkers, yourself, Chika, and with Okwe, especially when he was alive, really, working through the art world, trying to reveal a body of knowledge or trying to reveal a body which is deeply inspirational, which isn't the Eurocentric canon. So for me, it's almost not a sort of conscious effort to sort of be a theoretical architect as well, to work on theory as well as practice, but to find myself being a practitioner who has to work within the confluence of the two, simply because of the time that we're in. And it will change. And I think they will, I hope that within, a couple of decades, this discussion is no longer necessary in the same way, and there's a different confluence that is important in the world. But definitely this confluence is critical now. Lesley, sorry.
So I was going to say one of the things that's so important about David's practice, which has to do with the special nature of architecture education, where every 5 years, 4 years, the university has to undergo an accreditation by the professional body, which allows the university, it licenses the university to teach. So in the academy, there's always two forces at play. One is the production of new knowledge, which is the job of the university, and the other is the competency of the profession, and they're always, pulling. Not always in opposite directions, but there's tension. And what's really interesting about David's practice, and it goes back to this idea of the building of knowledge, is that he's one of the very few practitioners who translates that into built form. So all of a sudden, 20 years after his practice has started, in the academy, we're able to take the physical fruits of his endeavor and say, here, it's built. This is no longer a conversation about things that are peripheral to architecture. Here it is. And I think as time goes on, the trail that his practice is leaving behind enables and emboldens, if that's the right word, others to do the same form of translation. And at the moment, I think we're still in a very translatory phase, because we're taking not only knowledge that's been outside the canon, but also knowledge that's been deemed as inferior to or peripheral to. And that act of transforming it into material, into form, into structure, into site, into program, that's what architects do. And that, I think, we wouldn't be where we are today if it hadn't been for that kind of practice.
I'm going to ask one last question to both of you, and then we'll turn to the audience. I think there is enough time. Going to Venice, I know both of you have, David, you engaged with Venice before in different forms, whether designing the British pavilion or working with Okwi, also on his own, biennial, and then, of course, with the Ghana pavilion, which premiered in the last, biennial. Lesley, I know that you may not be able or respond to secrecy to reveal your concept of the biennial, but I'll ask you the question in a different way that may reveal. What does it mean for you now you have this opportunity to curate the next architecture biennial? And if you have any ideas that you're able to share at this stage.
So I have the president of the Biennale, Presidente Chukuto, who's sitting on my shoulder saying, don't say a word. But I think I was always very conscious of the historic nature of this. And in some senses, it's a catalyst, it gives you courage. At other moments, it's absolutely terrifying because, you're one person responding to something, but at the same time, you have to respond on behalf of. So there's a wider audience. But I also think it came at quite a good time. I'm nearly 60. In a way, this is the right time to do something like that. I think if I had been in my 40s, it would have been a different proposition. And as David was saying earlier, there is something about confluences, about events that happen that suddenly you realize, okay, this is the right moment to say something that, I think I've been saying for a very long time. But in many ways, the audience has either not understood it, as David was talking about his own work, or been ready to hear it. It's also about the ability both to speak and also to be heard. So it's an enormous honor and an enormous responsibility, I think. Yeah.
So David, I was about to ask you what's next for the Pavilion of Ghana. I heard that there is going to be one, but just reflecting on your encounter from Chrysophilis, British Pavilion, to Okwi's stage theater that you've designed, to the Ghana Pavilion, and to the next one, if you can reveal anything. I'll leave it up to you, because often the challenge is that many projects falter, especially in the context of Venice, because it's a very expensive, of course, ordeal, to say the least, and the whole complexity of dealing with Venice, one of the most ancient mercantile places, bureaucratically, money-wise, and everything. So, to you.
No, I've, since the beginning of my career, it seems to have had a very long relationship with Venice, and its pedagogy and its structure, from the project we did with Chrysophilis, Chris wanted to totally reimagine what a pavilion can be. In a way, I think it was the first African pavilion, really. in that sense, sort of changing the British Pavilion into this tropical sort of theme for a certain narrative of work that talked about Black culture. And then working with Oakweed, designing both the Giardini sort of arena, but also the Arsenali exhibition on, scenography was designed by me for him. And really understanding, the complexity of that sort of management. And then, then getting an opportunity through the Ghana government, the cultural ministry, to then really inaugurate and really concretize for them an ability to be able to produce, to have the culture of Ghana, always represented in the biennial. And so my job was to make the connections, set up the infrastructure, and support the curatorial vision, which Oki was also involved with myself and Nana Afroya. I have now shifted out of that because I have many things to do. So this project is now being undertaken by the cultural ministry, and they're doing it, and I am not involved in the next biennial. I'm a fan and an observer, but I think it's important for a new generation to take that on, and that the vision is then carried on and sort of executed. So we all look forward to seeing what Ghana will do in the next cycle, but I am not part of it.
Okay, thank you to both of you, but I wanted to shift to see if the audience has any. There are 16 minutes, I hope, so I could see, we could take Naminata. Yes? Go ahead. Any other person that I want to stand the hall? Okay. Any other person in any direction? Okay, so please.
Thank you so much for this beautiful intervention. My question is first a comment to Lesley. The idea of earning the right to be there, that's really brilliant because some of us don't think that, especially if we come from the world, quote unquote, the world. We think that we owed respect and all those things that come with it. So to earn the right to be there, that's very informative and a teaching moment for me. So the question has to do with security, the question of safety and stability on the continent, and how some of those questions shape how people should or will not return, especially when you're starting a center, a business. So how does the question of stability on the continent inform or did not inform your decision? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So you want to take a few questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hello, and thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask Sir David to describe his trail of work. That's it.
You hear the question?
Yes, I heard it. Yeah. Are we taking questions, or you just,
yeah.
I need, because I can't see anything, so.
Okay. One more.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay, so you have the microphone. Okay, go ahead, then we'll get to the microphone. That's Premesh Laloo from South Africa. He's a faculty at the Africa Institute.
So now that I'm at the Africa Institute, I can ask a question about South Africa that doesn't sound defensive. I suppose I want to ask this question about, in relation to the way in which we think about South Africa, Europe, and the kind of anti-racist struggles that now has come apart in that place. I mean, today, that entire infrastructure has fallen apart. I've just heard that there's a load shedding on a scale that is unprecedented in that country. But there are thousands and thousands of university students from sub-Saharan Africa who are now going to study there because they can't get into Europe or American universities. So I'm wondering about transnational and continent-wide engagements that can uphold some kind of future. And given that you have that provocative idea of futures in your title, how does one think about bringing to bear that idea as a continent-wide project?
So, three really, three really great questions. I suppose the question of stability and security, it's an interesting question because I think over the past 10, 15, maybe 20 years, the sense from the outside is that Ghana was becoming more stable, more secure, certainly at least politically, if not always economically. And that there was a kind of a basis from which institutions could begin to grow without the disruptive cycle of political change, you know, that plagued us in the 60s and 70s. So there's something about the longevity of political traditions that I think has really solidified. The question of security, and you know, to go back to David's point, and I do reference this all the time, I'm not married and I have no children. So I have a different relationship to what comes after me, and it also means it's a different relationship, you know, financially. I'm not providing for. So for me, the decision to come and set up shop was actually a very selfish decision. I have to think about myself, and I don't ever not think about that in the equation because I think it's a really important one. And then just to answer the question about South Africa, one of the things that I found when we started the Graduate School of Architecture was up until that point, you know, architecture was not really a profession that many black South Africans went into. You know, it was medicine, law, engineering, and there were schools of architecture in South Africa that didn't have a single black student. And when we changed the curriculum, our enrollment went overnight from 11 white students to 52 students, where the majority were black. And I understood immediately that what had been keeping the students out was the perception that architecture wasn't for them. That there was something about the discipline, which is very curious in a place like South Africa, which, you know, in order for apartheid to have taken place, there was collusion between the profession and the political system. And the minute that the black students understood that something that they brought to the table had value, or was able to offer something to the discipline, was the beginning of that moment where the students thought they are now claiming the right. And it's not quite as straightforward as earning the right. It's, you know, in the South African context, it's also different. But for the first time, they had language, they had tools to claim their right to be part of this discipline. And I witnessed in 5 years the most phenomenal transformation. And it was transformation in the kind of things that students would look at, the kinds of projects that they would imagine, the confidence to live not just out of their history, but also out of their imaginations. So for me, that 5-year period was incredibly liberating, but it's also liberating because of the context of South Africa. I think Ghana will be a completely different kettle of fish. And for most of the students, white, black, Indian, colored, the whole gamut, I think those 5 years was about them also understanding that they are part of Africa, that the kind of Eurocentric narrative that had been in place, certainly in the academy, was a fallacy.
David, if you have any reflections?
No, I guess I'm answering maybe the middle one about my trail, and maybe the idea of the security. I think that Ghana, you know, the whole continent isn't completely, you know, ready. There are different countries at different stages of their development, their political development, and I think that is a hindrance. But Ghana has had stability for, you know, political stability for at least the last 30 years. That seems more reassuring. But stability, you know, this idea of somehow security and stability being, you know, something that decides where you make home is also one that I question. I mean, I just think about look what's happening in Europe right now. I'm not sure about how we, you know, I think that the fundamental base is you deciding to make a commitment to something, which, yes, will have issues, and the question is how much are you prepared to take on. To do with the idea of the trail, I've always seen my work as leaving evidence, really. So for me in London, it was about showing that a young African could express ideas about who he was through the most mundane projects of clubs, bars, houses, studios, cultural infrastructure, that would show that there wasn't just one way of looking at the world, and that it wasn't necessarily against the world that it was in, but it was actually, for me, it was actually allowing that world that I was in to become even more relevant in the world that it was going into. So, a lot of the time people think that my work is trying to be a sort of protagonist against, but it's actually not. It's really, I'm also very interested in the way in which the work shows a bridging between different knowledge systems and how that creates hybridities, which are really what the future is. And in the US, the sort of magnification of the scale of the work really, I think, has allowed that opportunity to leave a body of evidence that says that a kind of full-blown career that is able to operate at all scales is possible with a different body of knowledge and can be embraced within other cultures. That don't, where the dominant hegemony and pedagogy is something else, that actually there can be a hybridity, and that hybridity is mirroring the hybridity which is happening in that society. I mean, American society is probably the most diverse in terms of its racial mixing, much more so than Europe, which is very minimal. But I think that really is really trying to demonstrate that the knowledge base for building that world has to come from the different knowledge bases of the communities that are coming into that world, and that it's made stronger through that transmission. And then for me, the work that I'm doing on the continent is really to finally unshackle from the mentality that a European architecture is the only way to make a modern architecture, which unfortunately the continent has become gripped by, that if it doesn't look like a Houston house or a Miami house or an LA house or a project from the West, it's somehow not modern, and that our own trajectories are as modern, were radically modern when they were made as responses to context and culture, and can be understood as lenses to then make a modern world. So the work that I'm very specifically interested in on the continent, in the Middle East, is really about really speaking to the richness of African culture and how it is very rich and able to create a basis for a very, very bright sort of future, the imagination of a bright future that can be made through architecture. I'm talking about through the lens of architecture alone. And really, the work that I choose on the continent is specifically to really make sure that I'm consolidating this viewpoint through the topologies that I'm working on. I hope that helps you.
Is it on? Okay, thank you. David, as the architect of the moment, both globally and locally in Ghana, how much scope how much influence do you have to humanize some of the controversial projects you're engaged in currently? Specifically this morning before lunch, we were talking about the impending demolition of the iconic art center in Accra to make room for the Marina Mall. And the tragedy of...
The mall? What?
Marine Drive.
Sorry, Marina Drive, sorry, the Marina Drive. Sorry.
Okay.
The demolition of the art center. sorry. I was thinking of your mall in Washington because that's where I first saw your walk.
Oh, I see.
Yes, so there was some concern about the artists, and although the art center has now become quite shabby, but still it's been a cultural home for so many people for so many decades. And so... Yes.
So...
Over lunch, sorry, can I just finish? Lesley defended you admirably, if I can be okra-mouthed. She said that within your design there's lots of space for theatres, cultural spaces. So the question really is, how much do you have the influence to be a sort of some kind of interlocutor for the artists who will be deprived of their space? Because it's who can mediate the discussion between them and the state to make sure they're not driven out and left out of the project?
So, absolutely. I took on the project with certain preconditions. There is an existing history on that site that has to be acknowledged and honored, but there's the history that is coming, that is being made right now. So it's about a future. And there are many discussions on that master plan. I am the master planner, so we have been very instrumental in making sure that culture, the right to culture, the right to the arts, the right for commerce, and the civic all come together in a way. The experiment of Marine Drive, as it's called, is to make a microcosm of Accra in one sort of center. So it's not even a CDB. Some people think it's about making a CDB a sort of, money banking sector. No, it's to make really a cross-section of the possibility of what Accra is at this incredibly important site. So obviously Black Star Square is preserved, it's enhanced with an axis and a planning order which says that nothing can be built in front of it. The Art Center artists there are two discussions happening. And in fact, before even the master plan was unveiled, there was huge discussions with all the artists about allowing them to be able to have prominent spaces on the waterfront, or having a market space, a specific structure that will allow them to reform again when the site is finished, when the programs are finished, and to allow expansion and to allow evolution, which is also important. It's not about being static. There's even the Ghana Club, which is right there in the middle of one of the sites. And there are very fruitful discussions about how they want to see themselves in the future and whether they want to preserve or enhance or grow. So what it's done is triggered a massive discussion about Accra's past history and arts and its future. And I think that that's a very healthy discussion. It's actually, in no way, the government has actually been incredibly restrained in that discussion. They could, eminent domain, they could just take it and run. But actually, there have been discussions with all the constituents, including the owner of a hotel who's on the site, who's being compensated. And there's the compensation that's happened across the various stakeholders has been extraordinary in my sort of observation of how these things work. So I think there's a perception that, it's big government and it's all top down and they're just kicking everybody out. But actually the truth is that it's actually not. And I think what the asset is, I think will really redefine the way in which Accra sees itself and hopefully become a model for how the city can understand how to use planning law and city planning, smart city planning to evolve, a very complicated situation which has come about because of all the kind of issues that we know about the development of African cities through, because of the lack of infrastructure and poverty and all those sort of things. So it's a sort of ambitious project, but it is absolutely about bringing on the stakeholders. That's the diversity and the richness that the project is about. So I'm sorry that you've heard that they're sort of being kicked off, but they've actually been in huge discussions about what is going to replace what they have at the moment. What they have can't be preserved as it is because it literally is not a fabric. It's not really, I think the Art Center is a really fantastic place, but it's not really about the fabric, it's about the artists. The fabric is makeshift. And that can be given a much stronger footing and given a place where it actually not only just is selling commerce, but it's also a place where people can congregate, where education can happen, where growth can happen, and where training can happen, which is what we're talking about.
Okay. Lesley, you have any comment on this? So the problem is that they told me to stop, and I have to stop, and I think we can carry the discussion. David, thank you so much for, this is the second time within a span of 6 days, you are physically in Sharjah and then remotely in Sharjah, which is important, and it shows your dedication to knowledge, to sharing your experiences, and to also the friendship that Sharjah has with you and we have with you. So thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you, Lesley,
Thank you.
for being here, for traveling all the way. And I know it's in the midst of a very busy time. I look forward to your biennial, and I'm sure I will be there. I'll make my reservation
Thank you.
in the next few days. So thank you so
Thank
much.
you, everybody. Thank you
Please,
for having me.
yeah. I know there are hands, but I'm sorry, just it's the time. There is a concluding session, and please stay for that. And please, that's the time we can reflect on the whole conference and even the conference prior to that, which is the March meeting that actually took up some of the issues that we discussed here. There was a restitution panel related mostly Africa, but it also had the global implication. We have a discussion on architecture, and it's extended here, and on art and culture. So please stay. The most important is that from here, after we finish the concluding session, we will going, there are buses going for the Hamriya. There are two very important, three actually very important projects that in Al-Hamriya. One is the exhibition of Gerald Annan Forson. For some of you who couldn't have the chance to see, please come join us and see it. It's curated by Jesse Weaver Shipley, who is there, the professor at Dartmouth University and an artist in his own, and a filmmaker too. And there's a beautiful film of interviews and reflection on the work of Gerald Annan Forson. Then there is Mimesis, an African soldier by John Okomfra, which is thanks to the Sharjah Art Foundation for restaging it, curating it for us, and for the guests that are coming from Ghana and other parts of the world in the occasion of Global Ghana. And finally, there's also an important performance by Elizabeth Efua Sutherland, and it will be performed at Al-Hamriya, and then we will go to dinner right after that. So please stay with us. I know they have been maybe exhausting for those of you who are suffering still from jet lag to sit through 3 days, but please, please join us. Thank you so much.